The sun beat down harshly on the small frontier town, its dusty main street shimmering with heat. Wagons lined the edges, horses tied to posts, and the smell of sweat, leather, and tobacco hung thick in the air. Yet the real weight came not from the weather, but from the anticipation. The crowd had gathered for something far more brutal than a market day, an auction. Not of goods, not of cattle, but of men. At the center stood a hastily built wooden platform. On it, the merchandise was displayed. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, with shackles cutting into his wrists. He wore only rough trousers, his chest bare, revealing scars across his skin, marks that spoke of both survival and punishment. His hair was long and tangled, his jaw set in grim silence. Though bound, his presence was undeniable. People muttered in low voices, half in awe, half in fear. The auctioneer, a rotund man with a face red from drink, strutted like a showman. His voice boomed across the square. "Here he is, folks! Stronger than any ox you've owned, wilder than any stallion you've tried to break. Don't be fooled. He ain't no man. He's a savage, a beast to be worked, chained, and beaten into usefulness. Who'll start the bidding?" Laughter and jeers answered. A rancher called out a sum. Another man, leaning against a post, spat into the dirt and shouted higher. Women watched from a distance, some with curiosity, others with revulsion. Children peeked between their mothers' skirts, wide-eyed at the spectacle. The man on the block stood motionless, like a carved figure of stone. His eyes scanned the crowd, not with panic, but with something harder, disdain, sorrow, perhaps even exhaustion. Every taunt, every degrading word hurled at him seemed to roll off, though his clenched fists betrayed the strain it took to remain still. As the bids rose, a cruel voice rang out. A wiry farmer, grinning through broken teeth, stepped closer, with a whip dangling from his hand. "Let's see if the beast has any fight in him," he shouted. He raised the whip high, the crowd roaring approval. The auctioneer didn't stop him. This was part of the show. Testing the savage for spirit only made him sell higher. The whip cracked against the air and then against flesh. The man flinched but did not cry out. His head lifted, eyes blazing now, his chest rising with barely restrained fury. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some chuckled at his restraint, others leaned in, eager to see him break. It was then, just beyond the edge of the square, that another figure arrived. A woman, plainly dressed, her bonnet shading her eyes, a basket of supplies on her arm. She had only meant to pass through, to collect flour and lamp oil before returning to her modest cabin. Yet the scene rooted her in place. Her gaze fixed on the shackled man, on the whip raised for another strike, on the cruel faces hungry for violence. Something in her chest tightened. She was a quiet soul, the kind who rarely spoke up in church, who endured neighbors' chatter without protest. But here, watching another human being treated like livestock, something inside her stirred with both horror and a strange, reckless courage. The whip cracked again, drawing a line of red across the man's back. Gasps rose, some delighted, some uneasy. The teacher's basket slipped from her hand, spilling apples across the dirt. She stepped forward without thinking, her voice carrying sharper than it ever had in her life. "Stop!" she cried, her words trembling but firm. The crowd turned, startled. She swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her throat. Then, louder this time, she said the words that would change everything. The town of Red Creek was not kind to outsiders, and even less kind to women who did not fit the mold. For 2 years, Miss Clara Whitfield had been the school teacher there, a woman in her late 20s, unmarried, with no family nearby. To the townsfolk, she was useful but unremarkable. She taught their children their letters and numbers, kept order with her quiet sternness, and then disappeared into the small cabin at the edge of town. People described her as plain, but respectable. Serious, but forgettable. Few wondered what she did in the evenings when her lantern glowed long into the night. Fewer still considered that her solitude cut deep, that each meal she ate alone pressed heavy on her spirit. On this particular morning, Clara had risen early to make the trek into town. Her pantry shelves had grown bare, and she needed flour. Soap and lamp oil she had saved carefully from her meager wages to afford them. The walk was long, her boots coated in dust by the time she reached the main street. She clutched her basket tightly, keeping her eyes down as she passed the saloon and the blacksmith's forge. She was used to the sidelong glances, the whispers, of poor thing, no husband, or worse, too proud to settle. What she was not used to, however, was the noise that reached her ears that day. A great crowd had gathered at the square, their voices carrying with a charged excitement. Clara slowed, curiosity battling her instinct to avoid notice. The murmur of men's shouts, women's laughter, and children's shrill cries drew her nearer. She reached the edge of the throng and craned her neck to see. At first she thought it was a livestock sale, some rancher bringing in a bull or stallion for auction. But then her eyes widened, her stomach tightening. It was not an animal in the center, but a man. The sight rooted her to the spot. He was enormous, taller than any man she had ever seen, with a body marked by scars and sun. Chains held his wrists, and though he stood proud, Clara could see the strain in the way his shoulders tensed. He was not speaking, not begging, just enduring the stares and insults. The auctioneer's voice rang out, filled with mockery. "Don't be fooled, folks. He's no man you'd bring into your parlor. He's a savage. Good for breaking horses, hauling timber, maybe scaring off coyotes. Who'll start the bidding?" The crowd roared with laughter. A rancher called a, price. Another shouted higher. Men nudged one another, speculating on how long it would take to break him. Clara felt her heart hammer. She had never seen such cruelty displayed so openly. Her school children were taught scripture, the words about kindness and treating others as neighbors. Yet here their parents gathered to watch another human sold as if he were nothing but a beast. Her basket grew heavy in her arms, the edges biting into her fingers. She wanted to turn away, to leave before anyone noticed her. She was a teacher, not a fighter. She could not change the way of the world. That was what she always told herself whenever loneliness gnawed at her heart. But when her gaze met his, all those careful walls inside her began to crack. For the briefest moment, his eyes lifted and found hers. They were not wild, not savage, as the auctioneer claimed. They held dignity, sorrow, and something more, an aching endurance awaiting for judgment that was not just. Clara's breath caught. She thought of her own isolation, of the way people dismissed her, overlooked her, spoke about her as though she were invisible. If this man was invisible to them in his humanity, she understood the pain. She swallowed hard, stepping closer to the crowd. A voice inside her whispered to look away, to continue to the mercantile, but her feet betrayed her, carrying her toward the square. She did not yet know she was walking toward the moment that would change both their lives. The crowd thickened around the platform, voices rising with a mix of amusement and cruelty. The auctioneer fanned himself with his hat, grinning broadly as he paraded the shackled man before eager bidders. "Look at him, folks. Big as a grizzly, strong as 3 men put together. A wild beast brought low for your use. Don't waste your coin on a weak back when you can own this brute." His words rang with showman's pride, as if he were peddling some exotic spectacle rather than a human being. The people answered with jeers. A rancher in a dusty hat shouted, "Bet he'll buck and bite the first man who tries to harness him." Laughter followed. Another spat tobacco juice into the dirt and sneered, "Only thing he's good for is swinging an axe or scaring crows." Children tugged at their mothers' skirts, wide-eyed with the thrill of seeing something forbidden. Some women shook, their heads muttering prayers under their breath, while others whispered gossip. Where had he come from? What had he done to end up here? How dangerous must he be? The crowd's voices painted him as something other, less than human. The man himself did not speak. His silence only fueled the mockery. He stood tall, shoulders squared, his face carved from stone. He seemed to refuse them even the satisfaction of seeing pain in his expression. Yet Clara, standing at the edge of the throng, noticed the way his hands flexed against the shackles, how the veins in his arms stood out from the tension. He was not unaffected. He was simply determined not to give them what they wanted. The auctioneer's assistant, a wiry man with mean eyes, strode across the platform and jabbed the captive in the ribs with a stick. "Let's see if the savage has a growl in him," he sneered. The crowd leaned forward, hungry for a reaction. But the man only lifted his head, eyes narrowing, jaw tightening. He did not strike back. That restraint only provoked more cruelty. A lanky farmer stepped forward, a whip coiled in his hand. "No beast is worth a dime if he won't show his teeth," he called. Without waiting for permission, he cracked the whip across the man's bare back. The sound split the air like a gunshot. The crowd erupted, some laughing, others gasping. Clara's hands flew to her mouth, her heart lurching at the sight. The man's body jerked at the sting, but no cry left his lips. Instead, his eyes blazed. Now with something fierce, a fire that made him look even taller, more imposing. "Ha! See that? There's the temper of a savage!" The farmer crowed, raising the whip again. Another voice rang out. "Bet he'll tear our house down when he finally snaps. Only a fool would bring him home." The auctioneer chuckled, playing along. "A beast like this needs a heavy hand, gentlemen. Show him weakness and he'll eat you alive." Clara's stomach turned. She had taught her pupils the lessons of Scripture, of compassion and fairness. She had told them every life mattered in the eyes of God, yet here their parents cheered the lash, entertained by suffering. The hypocrisy sickened her. The whip cracked, again splitting skin this time. A thin line of blood welled across the man's back. Clara flinched as though it had struck her instead. She wanted to close her eyes, to turn away and flee, but her body refused. Her gaze locked on his, and once more she saw something that none of them seemed willing to acknowledge. His eyes were not savage. They were wounded. Angry, yes, but with the anger of a man stripped of dignity, not a beast without reason. Clara's breath trembled in her chest. In that instant, the cruel laughter around her grew distant, muffled, as though she were underwater. All she could see was the man enduring humiliation with silent pride, and the whip raised again to cut him down. Further, her pulse thundered. The basket in her hands slipped, apples tumbling into the dust. The crack of the whip came again. And for the first time in her quiet, overlooked life, Clara felt something unshakable rising in her throat, words that would soon defy them all. The whip cracked through the air again, cruel and sharp, and Clara felt as though it had cut through her own skin. The crowd roared with satisfaction, their voices a fevered blend of excitement and scorn. Men shouted over one another with wagers on how long it would take for the savage to snap. Children squealed as if it were some carnival attraction. Even the women who looked away did so with resigned silence, unwilling to raise their voices against the spectacle. But Clara could not look away. Her breath came shallow, her pulse pounding so fiercely she could hear it in her ears. She was not brave by nature. She had never been one to stand in the middle of a crowd, never one to speak louder than she needed to. In her classroom, yes, she commanded authority, but that was a safe, orderly world, filled with children's questions and slates of chalk. Out here, in the public square, she was small, invisible, and often dismissed. Yet as she watched the man on the platform endure lash after lash without striking back, something cracked open inside her. It was not only pity, though compassion burned bright in her chest. It was recognition. Recognition of what it meant to be treated as though you were less than what you were. She, too, had known whispers behind her back, The sting of words meant to remind her that she was incomplete, unwanted, strange in her independence. But what she bore in gossip, he bore in chains and blood. The farmer raised his whip again. "No!" The word tore from Clara's throat before she realized it. It rang through the square, trembling but piercing. The whip froze in the air. Dozens of heads turned. Silence rippled outward like a wave, swallowing laughter and jeers alike. Clara's heart slammed against her ribs, her hands clammy, her face hot beneath her bonnet. Every instinct screamed at her to retreat, to shrink back into the anonymity of the crowd. But her feet held firm. Her voice shook, but she made it louder, steadier this time. "Stop this at once. Don't lay a hand on him again." The crowd blinked, stunned. Then a burst of laughter erupted. "Who said that?" A man jeered. Another snickered. "The schoolmarm? Don't tell me you've got a taste for savages, Miss Whitfield." Heat rose in Clara's cheeks, but she lifted her chin. The man on the platform was watching her now, his eyes locked on hers. His gaze was intense, unblinking, as if weighing her words, testing if she truly meant them. The auctioneer chuckled, clearly amused. Now, Miss Whitfield, this ain't no parlor game. You best keep to your books and children, eh? Leave the bidding to men who know what to do with a beast. Like this." But Clara's fear had already burned away into something fiercer. She took one shaky step forward, her skirts brushing the dirt. "He is no beast," she said firmly, her voice carrying further this time. "He is a man, and I'll buy him myself if that's what it takes to stop this cruelty." The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some men doubled over with laughter. A woman muttered, "She's gone mad." The farmer lowered his whip, sneering, You couldn't handle a dog, let alone this savage." Clara's hands trembled, but her resolve did not. "I have coin," she said, forcing her voice steady, "and I'll see him freed from your violence. I'll buy him." The auctioneer raised his brows, genuinely surprised. He glanced from Clara to the towering man on the platform, then back again, a slow grin spreading across his face. "Well, now, this is a turn I didn't expect." The crowd erupted once more, some jeering, others calling her a fool, but Clara stood her ground. Her heart still pounded, but her decision had been made. She had stepped out of silence, and there was no turning back. The silence that followed Clara's declaration lasted only a heartbeat, then the square erupted. "She's lost her mind," a woman cried, clutching her child closer as though Clara had just threatened the town itself. "Bah! She wouldn't." "Last a day with him!" a rancher bellowed, earning raucous laughter from the men clustered around him. "Schoolmarm's gone soft in the head," another shouted. "Probably thinks she can teach him his letters." The jeers rained down like stones. Some faces looked amused, others hostile, but none offered her sympathy. The auctioneer, instead of silencing the cruelty, fanned it with his grin. He tipped his hat toward Clara with exaggerated politeness. "Well now, Miss Whitfield." Bold words. From our quiet schoolmistress. "You say you'll buy him?" He gestured at the man on the platform. "You'd put down coin for a creature who'll rip the hinges off your door before you've even lit your evening lamp?" Laughter rippled again. The farmer with the whip coiled it slowly, smirking. "Don't waste your money, miss. Best let a real man take him, someone who knows how to handle savages." Clara's throat was dry, her palms slick with sweat, but she forced her chin higher. Every eye was on her, weighing, mocking, waiting for her to falter. She felt small beneath. Their stares, smaller than she ever had in her classroom when whispers of spinster and poor thing brushed her ears. Yet beneath the fear thrummed a harder, steadier truth. If she retreated now, she would never forgive herself. "I said I'll buy him," she repeated, her voice firm despite the tremor in her chest. "Name your price." The auctioneer squinted, half in disbelief, half in delight at the entertainment she provided. "And where's a school teacher get the coin for such a purchase, eh? You planning to trade your chalkboards for chains?" "I have coin," Clara said. Her hands shook as she clutched her basket, but her words rang clear. "Enough to meet your price." The crowd roared with laughter again, though this time some muttering sounded beneath it, uneasy, disapproving. A few women shook their heads, whispering to one another about impropriety. A schoolteacher living alone, buying a man. Scandalous, dangerous, foolish. One older rancher spat into the dirt, his voice sharp. "Mark my words, he'll turn on her. Might even kill her in her bed." Another called, "Let her have him! Better her blood than ours when he snaps!" Each word was a blow, but Clara stood her ground. She dared not look away from the platform, where the shackled man remained silent, watching. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes burned into hers, searching, testing. She had not expected gratitude or trust, only that he might recognize she was not one of those who jeered. The auctioneer rubbed his chin, clearly savoring the spectacle. "Well, folks, seems the lady is serious." He turned back to Clara, his voice dripping with condescension. "Tell you what, Miss Whitfield, I'll take your money, though don't say I didn't warn you. A savage is no husband, no farmhand, no protector. He's nothing but trouble." The word husband sent another wave of laughter through the crowd. Clara's cheeks burned, but she did not look away. She pressed her lips together, her silence a shield against their venom. Finally, the auctioneer clapped his hands. "Very well, sold to the brave or foolish schoolteacher." He gave a mocking bow. "Let's hope she has more steel in her than her frame suggests." The crowd erupted again, some jeering, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Clara stood rooted, her knees weak, her heart pounding. The backlash had been fierce, but she had not broken. And in that moment, as the man's chains were prepared to be handed into her keeping, she understood. She had stepped onto a path from which there was no turning back. The laughter of the crowd still echoed as Clara forced herself to step forward, though her knees trembled with every movement. The auctioneer's assistant, a wiry man with a twisted smile, hopped down from the platform and thrust out a grubby hand. "Coin first, schoolmarm," he said. "No charity here." Clara reached into her basket, pushing aside the scattered apples and pulling free the small leather pouch she had hidden beneath the cloth. She had saved the wages of many months, skimping on new shoes, mending dresses until the fabric nearly fell apart, and foregoing the little luxuries other women bought without thought. That money had been meant for winter firewood, a sturdier roof, perhaps even a piano someday for her students. But now, her fingers shook as she pressed the pouch into the assistant's hand. He weighed it, poured the coins into his palm, and let them clink back into the pouch with a sneer. "Well, I'll be." She wasn't bluffing. The auctioneer called out loudly, "Sold to Miss Clara Whitfield, our daring school teacher." His mockery was laced with glee, as if the sale itself were less important than the spectacle it had created. The crowd erupted once more, some cheering, some laughing, others muttering darkly. The assistant turned back to the platform, fumbling at the shackles with a ring of keys. The crowd leaned forward as the iron locks clanked open. The sound was sharp and heavy, like the breaking of an old sentence. The chains fell away from the man's wrists with a dull thud, leaving raw, rubbed skin exposed. For the first time, the man moved of his own will. He rolled his shoulders slowly, stretching arms that had been bound too long, and the crowd stepped back instinctively. Freed, he seemed even larger, towering above those around him, his presence radiating a restrained, dangerous strength. The farmer with the whip muttered, "She's a fool. He'll crush her before she reaches her cabin." But Clara stood her ground. Her throat was dry, her pulse racing, but she lifted her chin and looked at the man, not at his scars, not at his size, but at his face. His eyes, dark and steady, locked on hers. It was not gratitude she saw there, nor was it blind rage. It was a question, unspoken but heavy. Why? The assistant, clearly uneasy, shoved a length of rope toward Clara. You'll be wanting to keep him tied, for your own good. Clara glanced at the rope, then back at the man. The memory of the whip flashed in her mind, the way he had endured it without breaking. She took the rope but did not lift it. Instead, with trembling fingers, she let it drop back into the dust. He doesn't need this, she said softly. Her voice carried just enough for those nearest to hear, sparking another wave of laughter and disbelief. Mad, someone whispered. She'll regret it by sundown, another said. The man's gaze deepened, something flickering in it. Surprise, perhaps, or suspicion. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped down from the platform and stood beside her. He did not touch her, did not move closer than necessary, but his presence was overwhelming. Clara tightened her grip on her basket to steady. Herself? The auctioneer gave a mocking bow. There you have it, folks. Our schoolmarm's bought herself a savage. Let's all pray for her safety. The words earned more laughter, but beneath it, Clara could hear a hum of unease. Some of the townsfolk weren't laughing anymore. Clara turned her back on them, drawing a steadying breath. Come, she said softly, not knowing if he would follow, not knowing if he even understood her words. She stepped away from the platform. For a long, terrifying moment, she thought he might remain behind, that she would face the ridicule of having purchased someone who refused her. Then, with deliberate steps, he followed. The crowd parted to let them through, some jeering, others whispering. Clara kept her eyes forward, her cheeks burning but her resolve unbroken. She had made the exchange. The man was no longer theirs to mock, no longer theirs to chain. He was under her care now, and she had no idea what that would mean for either of them. The crowd's noise lingered behind them like a swarm of hornets, buzzing with jeers and laughter. Clara walked quickly, her boots kicking up little clouds of dust, her hands clutched tightly around the handle of her basket. She did not dare look back. Every nerve in her body screamed for her to retreat, to flee into the safety of her cabin and bolt the door behind her. Yet she forced herself to keep her steps steady. She could hear him behind her. His footsteps were heavier, slower, but sure, measured like the tread of a man who knew every eye was on him. She did not need to glance over her shoulder to feel the weight of his presence. He was close enough that she could sense the heat of him, close enough that every instinct told her she was walking with danger. And yet, she was not afraid in the way the crowd had expected. Around them, townsfolk moved aside. Some muttered curses under their breath. Others spat in the dirt, their contempt sharp and bitter. A group of boys ran along the opposite side of the street, laughing, mimicking growls and clawing gestures like children playing at savages. Clara's cheeks burned, but she lifted her chin and kept walking, each step an act of defiance. At the edge of town, the noise faded into the wind. The open road stretched before them, flanked by endless prairie grass swaying under the late sun. The silence between them grew heavier than the jeers had been. Clara's breaths came shallow, her fingers aching from how tightly she held the basket. She dared a glance at him. He was walking a few paces behind, his posture upright, his stride unhurried. Without chains, he seemed even more formidable, his shoulders broad, his arms thick with muscle from a life of labor and hardship. His face was solemn, unreadable, but his eyes, when they flicked toward her, were sharp, assessing. She stumbled over a stone in the road, catching herself quickly. He did not move to help her, nor did he mock her weakness. He simply watched, and when she found her footing again, he returned his gaze to the horizon. Clara swallowed hard. She had never been good with silence. In her classroom, the chatter of children filled the space. At church, hymns and prayers rose together. But Here, walking beside a man who had not spoken a word, silence pressed against her ribs like a weight. She longed to say something, anything, to prove she was not afraid, to prove she was worthy of the choice she had made. "You're free now," she murmured, her voice barely above the rustle of the prairie grass. The words sounded foolish the moment they left her lips. Free? He was not free. She had bought him, taken him from one set of chains into another, though she had done so to protect him. Did he see her as different from them, or only another captor with softer hands? He did not answer. His expression did not change. But Clara thought she saw something flicker in his eyes, something she could not name. They walked on. The sun dipped, lower, painting the sky with streaks of amber and rose. Clara's cabin lay still miles ahead, a small dot against the vastness of the plains. Her legs ached, her throat was dry, but she pressed forward, her resolve hardening with every step. For the first time, she allowed herself to wonder what awaited her when they reached home. Would he stay? Would he leave the moment he had the chance? Would he see her as savior, fool, or simply another obstacle in his long journey of endurance? The questions gnawed at her, but Clara knew one thing with clarity. She had chosen this path. And as she walked with the man the town had called a savage, she felt the first stirrings of something she. The sun had nearly slipped below the horizon by the time Clara's cabin came into view. It was a humble place, built of weathered logs, with a roof patched more times than she cared to admit. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney. She had banked her fire that morning before leaving. But the garden beside it was neat, the path swept of weeds. To Clara, it had always been a refuge from the judgments of town. Tonight, with the man walking silently at her side, it seemed far smaller than she remembered. She paused at the gate, her hand resting on the latch. Her heart hammered in her chest. She had brought him here. The townsfolk's mocking voices echoed. In her mind, "He'll tear your house down, he'll kill you in your bed." She drew a breath, steadying herself. She could not let fear undo the decision she had made. "Come in," she said softly, lifting the latch. She pushed the gate open and stepped onto the narrow path. Behind her, his heavy footsteps followed, without hesitation. Inside, the cabin was warm with the lingering scent of wood smoke, herbs drying by the rafters, and the faint sweetness of apples. Books were stacked neatly on a small table, and her chalkboard leaned against the wall near the shelves where she planned her lessons. It was modest, tidy, hardly a place fit for a giant man who had endured chains and jeers. For the first time, Clara wondered if he saw her life as pitiful compared to his suffering. She set her basket down, the apples rolling across the table. Then she turned to him. He stood near the doorway, filling the frame with his height. The low ceiling made him seem almost too large for the space. His eyes roamed slowly around the cabin, taking in every detail, but his face remained unreadable. Clara's throat was dry. "Sit, if you wish," she offered, gesturing to the rough-hewn chair by the hearth. He did not move at first. The silence pressed in, taut and uncertain. Finally, he stepped forward, pulled the chair out, and lowered himself into it with deliberate slowness. The wood creaked under his weight. Relief washed through her. He had not refused her offer, nor had he stormed out into the night. Clara busied herself at the cupboard, pulling out bread, a crock of butter, and the last of her salted meat. Her hands trembled as she worked, but she forced herself to move calmly. "You must be hungry," she said, more to fill the silence than from expectation of an answer. She cut thick slices of bread, laid the meat across, and set the plate before him. He looked at it, then at her. For a moment, she thought he might push it aside, but slowly he reached out, his large hand dwarfing the slice of bread. He ate with quiet efficiency, not like a man starved, but like one cautious not to waste. Clara watched from across the table, her own appetite gone, though she forced herself to take small bites to keep from staring. Afterward, she brought a basin of water and a cloth. She placed it before him, her hands trembling slightly. "For the blood?" she said softly, her eyes flicking toward the lash marks across his back. He hesitated, then dipped the cloth into the water and pressed it against his skin. The simple act, accepting her offering, felt monumental. The cabin was quiet, save for the crackle of the rekindled fire. Clara folded her hands tightly in her lap, her mind racing with all the doubts and fears the townsfolk had planted. Yet in this moment, watching him eat, watching him tend to his wounds without complaint, she felt a steadiness growing in her. He was no savage. He was a man. And for tonight, at least, he was under her roof. Could not yet name. Something stronger than fear. The days that followed were uneasy ones. Clara rose early as she always had, lighting the hearth, boiling water for tea, preparing lessons for the children. Yet everything was different now, for she was not alone. The man she had bought, though she hated that word, moved about the cabin with quiet watchfulness. He spoke little, often not at all, but she began to notice the small things. The way he mended the latch on her gate without being asked. How he carried buckets of water from the well as though they weighed nothing. How his presence filled the cabin with a gravity she could not explain. But if peace lived within her small home, suspicion thrived in the town. Word spread quickly. Red Creek was not large, and gossip moved faster than prairie fire. The schoolteacher had brought a savage into her house. Alone, unchaperoned. Worse, she had paid good coin for him. The whispers began with scandal, but soon turned sharper, darker. Men muttered that she had endangered the town. Women shook their heads, declaring her a lost cause. Children repeated their parents' words at school until Clara's stern glare silenced them. One evening, just as the sun dipped low and painted the plains with gold, trouble came knocking. Clara was sweeping her porch when 3 figures appeared on the road, men she recognized from the auction. The whip-bearing farmer led them, a smirk already tugging at his mouth. "Evenin', schoolmarm," he drawled as they neared the gate. "Heard you've still got that beast under your roof. Thought we'd check to see if you're still in one piece." Clara's grip tightened on the broom handle. "I don't recall inviting visitors," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The men laughed. "We figured you'd need protecting," another said. "Wouldn't want him to get riled and forget his manners." Behind her, the door creaked. Clara turned her head just enough to see him step onto the porch. He filled the doorway, broad shoulders blocking the light behind him, his eyes cold and unyielding. He said nothing, but the effect was immediate. The men shifted uneasily, though they masked it with bravado. "There he is," the farmer sneered. "Savage looks right at home, don't he? But make no mistake, schoolmarm, he's only waiting for his chance." He tapped the whip against his boot. "Why don't you let us take him off your hands before that happens?" Clara's heart thudded painfully, but she stepped forward, placing herself squarely between the men and the one. They mocked. Her hands trembled, but she tightened her grip on the broom like it was a weapon. "You'll do no such thing," she said, her voice ringing sharper than she expected. "He's under my roof, and he'll stay as long as he wishes. You will not touch him." The men blinked, surprised by her defiance. For a moment the only sound was the whisper of prairie grass in the evening breeze. Then the farmer's lip curled. "You think standing in front of him makes you safe?" He took a step forward. "Move aside, miss. You don't know what you're protecting." The man behind her shifted then, silent until now. He stepped down from the porch and came to stand at her side. He did not speak, but the air around him seemed to thrum with restrained power. His gaze fixed on the intruders, unflinching, unafraid. The farmer faltered, the whip lowering slightly. Clara drew a deep breath. "Leave," she commanded. "Now, or you'll regret the day you thought to threaten my home." For a long moment, the three men hesitated. Then, muttering curses, they turned back down the path, their bravado crumbling in the face of her defiance and his looming presence. When they were gone, Clara let out the breath she had been holding. Her knees trembled, but she forced herself to stand tall. She turned to look at the man beside her. He met her gaze with something new in his eyes, something softer, almost protective. In that moment, Clara realized that whatever the town believed, he was not her danger. He was her shield. The night after the confrontation with the townsmen was heavy with silence, yet not the same uneasy silence that had filled the cabin before. This was different. The air inside seemed alive, charged with something unspoken, as if both Clara and the man carried words they dared not release. She had rekindled the fire after dark, setting the small room aglow with amber light. The shadows danced across the walls, softening the rough edges of the logs. He sat near the hearth, his great frame still and steady, while Clara moved quietly about, putting away her books and folding the cloths she had used earlier to tend his wounds. Every so often her eyes flicked toward him. Each time, she found him watching the fire, his expression calm, unreadable. Yet beneath the quiet, Clara felt the shift. When she had stood between him and the farmers, it had not only been her bravery tested, it had been the start of something larger. She had chosen to defend him not as property, not as duty, but as a man worthy of dignity. And he had stepped to her side, not because he owed her, but because he had chosen to stand with her. That choice lingered in the space between them now, fragile and powerful all at once. When she finally sat down, her hands folded neatly in her lap, she could no longer ignore the need to speak. "They'll come again," she said quietly, her gaze fixed on the fire. "Men like that don't forget. They'll wait for the moment they think I'm weak or that you are." At first, she thought he would remain silent as he so often did. Then, his deep voice, rough from disuse, broke the stillness. "They will not harm you." The words were simple, but they struck Clara like a bell. Her eyes lifted, searching his face. He did not look at her. He still watched the flames. But there was no mistaking the weight in his tone. It was not boast nor threat. It was promise. Her throat tightened. She wanted to thank him, but the words caught. Instead, she asked softly, "Why?" "You owe me nothing." That made him turn. His dark eyes met hers, steady and piercing. For a moment, she felt as though he were looking through her, past her fears and doubts, into the marrow of who she was. "You saw me," he said at last. Clara blinked. "Saw you?" Not savage, not animal. His voice was low, halting, as if unused to shaping words. "You saw me." Her breath caught, and she realized her hands had clenched together in her lap. Tears pricked at her eyes, though she fought them back. "Yes," she whispered. "Because you are?" The fire crackled, filling the silence that followed. Neither of them moved. They did not need to. Something deeper had already shifted, threading between them like roots burrowing unseen beneath the soil. After a time, Clara rose to fetch a blanket. She laid it across his shoulders without a word. He looked up at her, and for the first time, his eyes softened with something like gratitude. He did not speak, but he did not need to. The simple acceptance of her gesture was enough. Later, as she lay in her small bed, staring at the ceiling beams above, Clara felt no fear of the man resting near her hearth. The townsfolk would call her a fool. Perhaps she was, but she also knew a truth they could not yet see. The man they called a savage was more honorable than most of them combined. And though no vow had been spoken, Clara understood that from this night forward their lives were bound together, not by chains of ownership or the cruelty of an auction block, but by a quiet, unbreakable promise forged in fire, defiance, and fragile trust.